The Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book the Third, which treats of the purgation of the active night of the memory and will, gives instruction how the soul is to behave with respect to the apprehensions of these two faculties, that it may come to union with God, according to the two faculties aforementioned, in perfect hope and charity. Chapter 1. The first faculty of the soul, which is the understanding, has now been instructed, through all its apprehensions, in the first theological virtue, which is faith, to the end that the soul may be united to God by means of the purity of faith, according to this faculty. It now remains to do likewise with respect to the other two faculties of the soul, which are memory and will, and to purify them likewise with respect to their apprehensions, to the end that, according to these two faculties also, the soul may come to union with God in perfect hope and charity. This will briefly be effected in this third book. We have now concluded our treatment of the understanding, which is the receptacle of all other objects, according to its mode of operation. And in treating of this, we have gone a great part of the whole way. It is therefore unnecessary for us to write at equal length with respect to these faculties. For it is not possible that if the spiritual man instructs his understanding in faith according to the doctrine which has been given him, he should not, in so doing, instruct the other two faculties in the other two virtues likewise. For the operations of each faculty depend upon the others. But since, in order to follow our manner of procedure, and in order, too, that we may be the better understood, we must necessarily speak of the proper and determinate matter, we shall here be obliged to set down the apprehensions proper to each faculty, and first those of the memory, making here such distinction between them as suffices for our purpose. This we shall be able to deduce from the distinction between their objects, which are three: natural, imaginary, and spiritual, according to which there are likewise three kinds of knowledge which come from the memory, namely, natural and supernatural, imaginary and spiritual. All these, by the divine favor, we shall treat here in due course, beginning with natural knowledge, which pertains to the most exterior objects. And we shall then treat of the affections of the will, wherewith we shall conclude this third book of the active spiritual night. Chapter 2, which treats of the natural apprehensions of the memory, and describes how the soul must be voided of them in order to be able to attain to union with God according to this faculty. It is necessary that in each of these books the reader should bear in mind the purpose of which we are speaking, for otherwise there may arise within him many such questions with respect to what he is reading, as might by this time be occurring to him with respect to what we have said of the understanding, and shall say now of the memory, and afterwards shall say of the will. For seeing how we annihilate the faculties with respect to their operations, it may perhaps seem to him that we are destroying the road of spiritual practice rather than constructing it. That would be true if we were seeking here only to instruct beginners, who are best prepared through these apprehensible and discursive apprehensions. But since we are here giving instruction to those who would progress farther in contemplation, even to union with God, to which end all of these means and exercises of sense concerning the faculties must recede into the background and be put to silence, to the end that God may of his own accord work divine union in the soul, it is necessary to proceed by this method of disencumbering and emptying the soul, and causing it to reject the natural jurisdiction and operations of the faculties, so that they may become capable of infusion and illumination from supernatural sources. For their capacity cannot attain to so lofty an experience, but will rather hinder it, if it be not disregarded. And thus, if it be true, as it is, that the soul must proceed in its growing knowledge of God by learning that which he is not, rather than that which he is, in order to come to him, it must proceed by renouncing and rejecting, to the very uttermost, everything in its apprehensions that it is possible to renounce, whether this be natural or supernatural. We shall proceed with this end in view with regard to the memory, drawing it out from its natural state and limitations, and causing it to rise above itself, that is, above all distinct knowledge and apprehensible possession, to the supreme hope of God, who is incomprehensible. Beginning then with natural knowledge, I say that natural knowledge in the memory consists of all the kinds of knowledge that the memory can form concerning the objects of the 5 bodily senses, namely, hearing, sight, taste, smell, and touch, and all kinds of knowledge of this type which it is possible to form and fashion. Of all these forms and kinds of knowledge the soul must strip and void itself, and it must strive to lose the imaginary apprehension of them, so that there may be left in it no kind of impression of knowledge, nor trace of anything soever, but rather the soul must remain barren and bare, as if these forms had never passed through it, and in total oblivion and suspension. And this cannot happen unless the memory be annihilated as to all its forms, if it is to be united with God. For it cannot happen save by total separation from all forms which are not God, for God comes beneath no definite form or kind of knowledge whatsoever, as we have said in treating of the night of the understanding. And since, as Christ says, no man can serve 2 masters, the memory cannot be united both with God and with forms and distinct kinds of knowledge. And as God has no form or image that can be comprehended by the memory, it follows that when the memory is united with God, as is seen too every day by experience, it remains without form and without figure, its imagination being lost, and itself being absorbed in a supreme good, and in a great oblivion, remembering nothing. For that divine union voids its fancy, and sweeps it clean of all forms and kinds of knowledge, and raises it to the supernatural. Now, there sometimes comes to pass here a notable thing, for occasionally, when God brings about these touches of union in the memory, the brain, where memory has its seat, is so perceptibly upset that it seems as if it becomes quite inert, and its judgment and sense are lost. This is sometimes more perceptible and sometimes less so, according to the strength of this touch. And then, by reason of this union, the memory is voided and purged, as I say, of all kinds of knowledge. It remains in oblivion, at times in complete oblivion, so that it has to put forth a great effort and to labor greatly in order to remember anything. And sometimes this oblivion of the memory and suspension of the imagination reach such a point, because of the union of the memory with God, that a long time passes without the soul's perceiving it, or knowing what has taken place during that period. And as the imaginative faculty is then in suspension, it feels nothing that is done to it, not even things that cause pain. For without imagination there is no feeling, not even coming through thought, since this exists not. And to the end that God may bring about these touches of union, the soul must needs withdraw its memory from all apprehensible kinds of knowledge. And it is to be noted that these suspensions come not to pass in those that are already perfect, since they have attained to perfect union, and these suspensions belong to the beginning of union. Someone will remark that all this seems very well, but that it leads to the destruction of the natural use and course of the faculties, and reduces man to the state of a beast, a state of oblivion, and even worse, since he becomes incapable of reasoning or of remembering his natural functions and necessities. It will be argued that God destroys not nature, but rather perfects it, and that from this teaching there necessarily follows its destruction when that which pertains to morality and reason is not practiced and is forgotten. Neither is that which is natural practiced. For, it will be said, none of these things can be remembered, as the soul is deprived of forms and kinds of knowledge which are the means of remembrance. To this I reply that the more nearly the memory attains to union with God, the more do distinct kinds of knowledge become perfected within it until it loses them entirely, namely, when it attains to the state of union in perfection. And thus at the beginning, when this is first taking place, the soul cannot but fall into great oblivion with respect to all things, since forms and kinds of knowledge are being erased from it, and therefore it is very negligent concerning its outward behavior and usage, forgetting to eat or drink, and being uncertain if it has done this or no, if it has seen this or no, if it has said this or no, because of the absorption of the memory in God. But when it once attains to the habit of union, which is a supreme blessing, it no longer has these periods of oblivion, after this manner, in that which pertains to natural and moral reason. Actions which are seemly and necessary, indeed, it performs with a much greater degree of circumspection, although it performs them no longer by means of forms and manners of knowledge pertaining to the memory. For when it has the habit of union, which is a supernatural state, memory and the other faculties fail it completely in their natural functions, and pass beyond their natural limitations, even to God, who is supernatural. And thus, when the memory is transformed in God, it cannot receive impressions of forms or kinds of knowledge. Wherefore the functions of the memory and of the other faculties in this state are all divine. For when at last God possesses the faculties and has become the entire master of them through their transformation into himself, it is he himself who moves and commands them divinely, according to his divine spirit and will. And the result of this is that the operations of the soul are not distinct, but all that it does is of God, and its operations are divine, so that, even as St. Paul says, he that is joined unto God becomes one spirit with him. Hence it comes to pass that the operations of the soul in union are of the divine spirit and are divine. And hence it comes that the actions of such souls are only those that are seemly and reasonable, and not those that are ill-beseeming. For the Spirit of God teaches them that which they ought to know, and causes them to be ignorant of that which it behooves them not to know, and to remember that which they have to remember, with or without forms, and to forget that which they should forget. And it makes them love that which they have to love, and not to love that which is not in God. And thus all the first motions of the faculties of such souls are divine, and it is not to be wondered at that the motions and operations of these faculties should be divine, since they are transformed in the divine being. Of these operations I will give a few examples. Let this be one. A person asks another who is in this state to commend him to God. This person will not remember to do so by means of any form or kind of knowledge that remains in his memory concerning that other person. If it be right that he should recommend him to God, which will be if God desires to receive a prayer for that person, God will move his will and give him a desire to pray for him. And if God desires not such prayer, that other person will not be able nor will desire to pray, though he make great efforts to do so. And at times God will cause him to pray for others of whom he has no knowledge nor has ever heard. And this is because, as I have said, God alone moves the faculties of these souls to do those works which are meet, according to the will and ordinance of God, and they cannot be moved to do others. And thus the works and prayers of these souls are always effectual. Such were those of the most glorious Virgin, Our Lady, who being raised to this high estate from the beginning, had never the form of any creature imprinted in her soul, neither was moved by such, but was invariably guided by the Holy Spirit. Another example. At a certain time, a person in this state has to attend to some necessary business. He will remember it by no kind of form, but without his knowing how, it will come to his soul, at the time and in the manner that it ought to come, and that without fail. And not only in these things does the Holy Spirit give such persons light, but also in many others, relating both to the present and to the future, and even, in many cases, as regards those absent from them. And although at times this comes to pass through intellectual forms, it frequently happens without the intervention of any forms that can be apprehended, so that these persons know not how they know. But this comes to them from the divine wisdom. For since these souls exercise themselves in knowing and apprehending nothing with the faculties, they come in general, as we have said in the Mount, to know everything, according to that which the wise man says, "The worker of all things, who is wisdom, taught me all things." You will say perhaps that the soul will be unable to void and deprive its memory of all forms and fancies, to such an extent as to be able to attain to so lofty a state. For there are two things so difficult that their accomplishment surpasses human ability and strength, namely, to throw off with one's natural powers that which is natural, which is hard enough, and to attain and be united to the supernatural, which is much more difficult. Indeed, to speak the truth, is impossible with natural ability alone. The truth, I repeat, is that God must place the soul in this supernatural state. But the soul, as far as in it lies, must be continually preparing itself, and this it can do by natural means, especially with the help that God is continually giving it. And thus, as the soul, for its own part, enters into this renunciation and self-emptying of forms, so God begins to give it the possession of union. And this God works passively in the soul, as we shall say, deodante, when we treat of the passive night of the soul. And thus, when it shall please God, and according to the manner of the soul's preparation, He will grant it the habit of perfect and divine union. And the divine effects which God produces in the soul, when He has granted it this habit, both as to the understanding and as to the memory and will, we shall not describe in this account of the soul's active purgation and night, for this alone will not bring the soul to divine union. We shall speak of these effects, however, in treating of the passive night, by means of which is brought about the union of the soul with God. And so I shall speak here only of the necessary means whereby the memory may place itself actively in this night and purgation as far as lies in its power. And these means are that the spiritual man must habitually exercise caution after this manner. All the things that he hears, sees, smells, tastes, or touches, he must be careful not to store up or collect in his memory, but he must allow himself to forget them immediately. And this he must accomplish, if need be, with the same efficacy as that with which others contrive to remember them, so that there remains in his memory no knowledge or image of them whatsoever. It must be with him as if they existed not in the world, and his memory must be left free and disencumbered of them, and be tied to no consideration, whether from above or from below, as if he had no faculty of memory. He must freely allow everything to fall into oblivion, as though all things were a hindrance to him, and in fact, everything that is natural, if one attempt to make use of it in supernatural manners, is a hindrance rather than a help. And if those questions and objections which arose above with respect to the understanding should also arise here, the objections, that is to say, that the soul is doing nothing, is wasting its time, and is depriving itself of spiritual blessings which it might well receive through the memory, the answer to this has already been given, and will be given again farther on in our treatment of the passive night. Wherefore there is no need for us to dwell upon it here. It is needful only to observe that, although at certain times the benefit of this suspension of forms and of all knowledge may not be realized, the spiritual man must not for that reason grow weary, for in his own time God will not fail to succor him. To attain to so great a blessing, it behooves the soul to endure much, and to suffer with patience and hope. And although it is true that hardly any soul will be found that is moved by God in all things and at all times, and has such continual union with God that without the mediation of any form its faculties are ever moved divinely, there are nevertheless souls who in their operations are very habitually moved by God, and these are not they that are moved of themselves. For as St. Paul says, the sons of God who are transformed and united in God are moved by the Spirit of God, that is, moved to perform divine work in their faculties. And it is no marvel that their operations should be divine, since the union of the soul is divine. End of Chapter 2 of Book 3.